So far, we've discussed many types of attack that are purely in-network, abusing the network protocols. In reality, we see that many of the attacks on computer systems are attacking the applications that run on these computer systems. And to know which applications are running, the attackers will have to do some form of reconnaissance. They need to find out by means of scanning what the applications are that are currently running. So this is what we're going to look at next. It's sort of a step towards the next topic, which is all about application security. So we want to know what services are available at the remote site. For instance, there could be a web server running if there is activity on port 80. Or there could be a mail server running if there's activity at port 25. So these are all running on well-known ports. And in addition, we may want to fingerprint the environment on which this is running. So is this actually a Linux machine or a Windows machine or some other machine? Okay, and which application, if it's a web server, which web server is actually running? Is this Apache? Is it Nginx? Which version? Because as an attacker, you want to know this kind of information because you want to look at the version of the system that is running and the kind of service that's running to see whether or not you have vulnerability in that, if you know of a vulnerability in that application, and if you can exploit this. So there's different ways in which we can do scanning, and as usual, we're going to start with the simple scans and then gradually progress to somewhat more difficult. They're not super complicated. This is not as difficult as, say, TCP hijacking or so. Okay, and one of the simplest scans that we can do is a UDP port scan, and we use that to find out if there are any UDP services running. For instance, the DNS server, the name servers run on UDP port 53. So if we want to find out if there's any activity on port 53, we simply send a UDP packet. A zero-length UDP packet is sent to each port. So at least each port in which we're interested. Say we're interested in port 53 and a bunch of other ports. We send these packets there, and then we wait for the reply. If there is a reply, an ICMP error message saying that the port is unreachable, the service is not there. It's unavailable. Okay. Unfortunately for the attacker, many implementations of the stack, they limit the error message rate. So the scan may be very slow. Okay. If there's no reply, it's either open or it's filtered, so you don't actually receive the reply. Okay. Like I said, it's a very slow scan. Now, to do these kind of scans, we have really mature tools, so there's nothing that we need to develop there. And the tool that is probably most popular in this area is known as Nmap, which runs on Linux systems, on Windows systems, and what have you. And it simply allows you to do an UDP scan doing an SU, and then you're scanning this host here. Okay. And you can see that it now starts an Nmap, network mapper, to find out which ports are open. And here you see the UDP ports that are open. Okay, and it's NetBIOS ports in this particular case. What happens if we run this scan? We send UDP packets with zero length to the victim host at different port numbers. Okay, and here you can see that for some of these port numbers, for 134 and for, let's see, 131, 132, 135, 139, we all got this ICMP unreachable, port unreachable message. So there the service is not available. However, I think if we scan very carefully, there must be one of them here that is actually available. Okay. So that's a UDP port scan. And I would have to check this 133 is unreachable. Let's see, which one is do we not receive? We have 1, 3. 1, 132, 133, 130, 134, 135, 136. I don't see any. Oh, 136, 137, 137 might be open. I'm not entirely sure. So it might also be still waiting for the port unreachable message to come back. Anyway, so just by looking at the responses that come back, sometimes a little bit later, we know whether or not the port is open or not. Now, for TCP, there are more options. So we can try to find out which services are available on the victim host by trying to set up connections to the victim host, right? So the simplest thing that we can do is simply try, right? Use Telnet essentially to connect to a particular TCP port number. Okay, so we do a TCP port scan, and these services are statically associated with some port, and there's some well-known ports, and we can see whether or not there's a service listening on that well-known port. Okay, and what we can do is set up a connection to that port, and if the handshake is successful, then clearly that service is available. At least something is listening on that port number. And it's an easy thing to do, and you can do it without being root. So you don't need elevated privileges to run a port scan, a TCP port scan. You can just literally do a telnet to each of these port numbers. Unfortunately, it's a relatively noisy way of doing the scan because every successful attempt, every connection that is made will be logged, right? So that actually leaves clearly a trace, and you're sending a lot of traffic there. So this is known as a connect scan. And again, Nmap comes to the rescue. It allows us to do a connect scan by doing an S, T, and then the port number that we want to scan. Oh, sorry, the IP address that we want to scan. Okay, and we see that in this particular case, the scan starts and it finds a bunch of open ports. There's the mail port, right? SMTP. There's port 80, which is for the web. There's a bunch of other ports that are open in this particular case. 22 for SSH connection. So these port numbers are open, and it's conducted using this open scan. We can also try to be a little less visible by doing half open scans, also known as SYN scanning. In this particular case, what we do is we do send a SYN packet, wait for the SYN-ACK, but never complete the TCP handshake. We never complete the TCP handshake, so it will never be logged on the remote side. Okay, so what we do is we wait for the SYN-ACK, and if there's no SYN-ACK, there's probably, if the port is closed, going to be a reset packet. Okay, and rather than completing the three-way handshake, we send a reset packet instead of the ACK packet. Okay, so this will not be logged by the operating system or the application, and hence we're a little bit less visible. The downside is that we cannot easily do this without root privileges. We need to send specific sequences of messages, and if we use tools such as tools that are available for user space applications, say Telnet, to do this, it will automatically complete that three-way handshake. Okay, so here we need root privileges. But anyway, if we do this, we can actually see the same ports that are open. So we're doing an Nmap, and now we specify -S, capital S, and well, first attempt fails because we don't have root privileges. So we need to do this sudo, so with root privileges, in order to be successful at this. And then we find the port numbers that are open. We see again SSH, SMTP, HTTP, these port numbers that we saw earlier also. Okay. Sometimes firewalls, so the enterprise networks, protect themselves by filtering out all the SYN packets coming from the outside world. Right? You don't want anybody to set up connections from the outside world to any machines inside your network. So you simply filter out all the packets that contain a TCP, the first phase of the TCP handshake. Okay, so what can we do in that case? Well, now it becomes a little bit more complicated, but perhaps we can do something still. And in this particular case, what we're trying to do is a TCP fin scan. So it's really odd because what we're doing is the first packet that we're sending, so part of our scan, is going to be a TCP segment that has the fin flag set, which you normally use to terminate a connection. Okay. Now, what you're banking on is the behavior of the operating system network stack that in response to these kind of fin packets. So in most TCP/IP implementations, if the port is closed and it receives a fin packet, it will send back a reset packet. But if the port is open, the fin packet is simply ignored. So in that case, after some timeout, you'll actually know that the port is open. Your operating system may differ a little bit in how it handles these things. Windows will simply send back a reset packet in all cases. Okay. But the point is that even if you cannot do the usual connection setup, you can try different kinds of behavior, because sometimes these network stacks behave differently to unusual packets that should not have been received in this particular circumstance. Okay, and besides the fin packet, we can try others. For instance, we can try sending packets with all the flags set, right? We call this a Christmas scan because your packet is lit up like a Christmas tree. Okay, so you send a packet with the fin flag on, the push flag on, and the urgent flag on. Okay, Christmas scan. Or we send a packet without any flags, so the so-called null scan. So we can try all of these different things, and depending on your operating system, the behavior may be different for the cases where there's someone listening on a port and when there's someone not listening on a port, an open port or a closed port. So here's an example of such a fin scan. Again, we use Nmap, and because we cannot just send fin packets as an ordinary user, we have to run this with root privileges. Okay, we're sending a fin scan -S capital F, and we find again that there are certain ports that we saw earlier, 22, 25, and 80. They're all open. Okay. A slightly more complicated scan that resembles to some extent one of the attacks, the TCP hijacking attacks that we discussed, is known as idle scanning, and it uses, just like that off-path TCP hijacking attack, it uses the IP identifier, the IP ID, okay, as a measure for determining whether or not there has been communication. So in this particular case, we use a relay victim to scan the actual victim that we want to scan. Okay, so what we do is we send a TCP SYN packet to a target, and we send that packet with a spoofed IP address, pretending to come from the relay. Okay? And the target then replies to the relay. The target replies to the relay, and the target replies to the relay with a SYN-ACK, right? Because we send a SYN to that target, and we'll reply with a SYN-ACK. If the port is open, right? So if the port is open, it will reply with a SYN-ACK to this relay. Okay. If it's not open, it will reply with a reset packet. Now, what the attacker is going to do is look at the IP identifier of the victim before and after each of these port probes, and check whether or not there was a jump. Just like in the previous case, what we saw in the TCP hijacking exploits, right? The TCP hijacking attacks. We see if there's a jump in the IP ID. Now, if it has increased, the port on the target was open, because then a packet has been sent in response to the SYN-ACK, and if it has not increased, the port on the target was closed. Now, what does that mean? Why would it send the packet? Now let's have a look at the example in in a graphical form. Okay, but it's important to note that this is again using a global counter as a side channel. Okay, so let's have a look at what this looks like in practice. So we have a victim here, a relay here, and an attacker from outside. Okay, and what the attacker is going to do is first it's going to send a packet to the relay with a SYN and ACK flag set. So it's a packet that doesn't set up a connection. It's confusing the relay, and the relay is simply going to respond with a reset segment. Okay. Now, what purpose does that serve? Nothing really, except that it gives us the IP ID of the relay. Okay. And once we know that, we're now going to contact the victim. We're going to contact the victim with a SYN packet to, say, the port 80, pretending to come from the relay. So it's going to spoof the IP address. So that means that the victim will reply to the relay. Okay, and it's going to reply with a SYN-ACK if the port was open, right? If the port was not open, it's going to be a reset. But if this relay receives, again, if it receives a SYN-ACK, it's just going to reply, just like it did to us, with a reset. It's going to reply with a reset, and that means that the IP identifier is going to jump from 1234 to 1235. Okay, and in the last phase of our scan, we're going to sample the IP identifier again by sending again a SYN-ACK to the relay, and the relay is going to respond with a reset packet. And now we see that the IP identifier has jumped by 2. Right? And that means that this port must have been open on this victim side. Okay. Why is this good? Well, the victim never sees any traffic from an unsuspect site, right? So it never, from a suspect site. It never received, as far as it could tell, any data from the attacker. It's always coming from the relay. This is known as an idle scan, because for this to work, this machine here must be relatively idle, right? It mustn't receive a lot of traffic, because otherwise we may get spurious updates in the IP identifier. Okay, so it should be relatively idle. And then we use the fact that this victim replied here, which solicited a reply from the relay, which made the IP identifier jump to determine that this port number here was open. Okay, idle scanning. Okay, and clearly it's all about this IP identifier that we use as a side channel. So what can we do? Well, we can make sure that it's not so easy to use it. For instance, by using these IP ID sequences, the IP ID counters, only on a per connection basis, on a per socket basis. We saw that earlier. Or to zero out the IP identifier if the don't fragment bit is set. Or randomize the IP identifier. And all of these solutions have been tried. And like we saw earlier, in Linux beyond version 4.18, the selection of the IP ID counter is a little bit more complicated. We saw that, for a packet that is generated, if it's a reset packet, the IP identifier would be 0. If it's not a reset packet, it would typically use a per socket counter, and only in some unusual cases, if the don't fragment don't fragment flag is not set, it will actually use one of 2048 counters based on a hash over some fields in your packet. Okay, so the question is, and so this is relatively complicated, but the question is this good enough? Well, we already answered that question in our discussion on TCP spoofing. Okay, so idle scanning and the use of IP ID as a side channel. Apparently, is applicable to a number of different primitives for the attacker. It's useful for IP spoofing, but also for port scanning. Finally, and this is somewhat related to scanning, but also to some other things that we can do, we're going to look at another application layer protocol as an example, a historic example. Okay, so far most of the examples have been based on DNS. Now we're going to look at FTP. So the FTP servers is still being used. There's many more FTP servers than you think, even though most people consider it an old protocol. And indeed, it's actually quite old. It was initially specified in RFC 542 in 1973. And FTP provides a way to transfer files. So normally we used probably web or some secure copy nowadays, but in the old days we used FTP a lot, and like I said, there are still many more FTP servers than perhaps you would like. FTP is based on TCP, and it's a little complicated in the way it operates. So you have two different channels. You have a connection for commands, and you have a connection for the actual data transfer. Okay, so the FTP server listens on port 21, and you can connect to that, log in, and then provide commands, for instance, to retrieve a file. But retrieving the file, so the actual transfer of the file, will then use another connection, a data connection. Okay. Commands are not all that dissimilar from what we use in HTTP. So there's get and put commands in this particular case. Okay. So there's two different streams. There's a control stream and a data stream. And the control stream is really just used for commands. So you type in things such as get and put and list and if you want to list a directory and so on. And the data stream is used for actually transferring that the output. Okay. Now there's different ways in which FTP may operate. So the client may tell a server to use a particular IP address and port number using a port command. That means that the data connection will be set up to that particular TCP address and port number. Okay, so the server then opens a connection from port 20 on the server side to this port that is specified by the client. And then the transfer is executed and the connection will be closed. So here is how that operates. The client sets up a connection to port 21 and provides over this command stream its username, and then the server asks for the password, and the client types in the password. So the command stream is connecting to port 21 and some arbitrary port number on the client side. Okay. If the password was correct, the server will tell the client so, and in this particular case, the client now provides the port command, and the port command provides the IP address, ABCD, and the port number in 2 bytes over the command stream. Okay, and if this command was successful, the client can now retrieve a file, for instance, retrieve the file name, and this file name will be transmitted by the server over a stream, over a connection that is set up to this IP address and this port number. So the IP address is ABCD, and the port number is, well, it's 2 bytes, so it's E times 256 plus F. That's where the data will transfer. That's one way to do it. You can also use FTP in passive mode. In that case, it works a little bit differently. You log in with your password and say that's successful. Now you specify that you want to operate in passive mode. Okay, and now the server tells you as a client which IP address will be used and which port number will be used for the data transfer. Okay. Now, if you open the connection and retrieve a file name, you will actually transfer the data over the connection to this port number, the port number that is provided by the client, by the server. So K times 256 plus L. Okay, and that's where the data will be transferred over this TCP connection. So two ways in which we can operate FTP. Great. So what are some of the vulnerabilities? Well, FTP has a number of problems. So one of the things that you might have is that if you have an FTP server and you allow a user of the FTP server to write into a home directory, then there might be a problem if there are certain files that can be corrupted. For instance, the rhost file in the old days. Okay, because they're sensitive files, they determine who can log in to that machine. Because if an anonymous user is able to write into that, the anonymous user can simply add ++ into that .rhost file. And we already saw what the consequences are. You can then log in from anywhere without, and anyone can log in from anywhere without username and password. Okay. So the access of a file system to FTP via FTP should be minimized. The other thing that you can do is steal connections. For instance, if there's a use of FTP in passive mode, what you can do is race, right? So the attacker can connect to the port that was opened by the server determines the port before the client connects to it. And then whenever the client tries to retrieve data, the data will be sent to the server instead of to the client. Connections theft. And finally, what we can do is what is known as an FTP bounce attack, which can be used for port scanning also. And that's where the connection is with port scanning. So remember, if we have a port command, the client tells the server which port to be used when you're opening a data connection. And actually, not just which port to use, but even which IP address to use, right? So you can actually specify, and this was part of the design of FTP in the beginning, that you could specify that the data would be transferred to another IP address, to another machine. Okay, this was considered useful at the time. It's no longer particularly useful nowadays. So the address that you specify, the IP address, does not have to be the same as the client's IP address. You can specify another IP address. Okay, and that means that you can instruct a server. To connect to some remote host. Okay, and that's useful because it allows you to scan possibly behind a firewall. So say you have only an FTP server that you can connect to, but you would like to scan some other IP addresses in that same network. Okay, but you can't connect to it directly because a firewall will block all your traffic. Now what you can do is you can connect to the FTP server and then let the FTP server set up connections to other machines and different port numbers for you. Okay? This you can use to perform a port scan. Okay? So you can scan, you can probe behind the firewall. Okay? Moreover, you can launch attacks through this method if you're able to pump data into those connections. For instance, if you have an FTP writable directory, you can get the data. So you can first write the data to the directory and then get the data and stream that into the connection. Okay, and that allows you to bypass all sorts of restrictions. Okay, so let's have a look at what the old style FTP bounce attack looks like. And nowadays, this is typically no longer possible because FTP no longer allows you to set up connections to arbitrary machines anymore, and it's a useful restriction. But here it is. We have an old machine that still allowed you to do that, and we see here that in the log of the server, we first had an attacker that logged in with a username and password. So it actually had an account on the machine. The user was logged in successfully. And then it did a port command to specify that the data stream was to connect to 10.0 18.35 at port 80, right? So a web server, and then the users send the command list, which lists whatever is in the directory and connects to this port number and IP address. And it turns out that the transfer was complete. Okay, so it was a successful transfer, and that means that there was a port open. So apparently the server at the IP address 10.0.18.35 did have a web server running at port 80. And next thing it does is it tries another port, right? So in this case, it does a port command and trying to connect to 31 times 256 plus 144, which is port 8080. Okay, and 8080 is an alternative port that is also used quite a lot for web services. Okay, and the port command was successful, but when we do a list, it turns out that the file transfer is aborted. There's no web server listening on port 8080, it seems. Okay, next thing to try is to connect to port, same service still, same IP address, port 2 times 256 plus 512 plus 154, which is 666. Okay, and you do a list, and it turns out that the connection was also refused. It was not successful. And finally, we tried to connect to port 21, an FTP port, on that IP address, and we do a list, and it seems that this transfer was complete. So it seems that that port number was also open. Like I said, what this shows is that some of these features that may have been useful at the time are in retrospect highly dangerous in the hands of an attacker, because you can use them to indirectly scan. And while FTP bounds attacks are on almost all the FTP servers no longer possible, because modern FTP services don't allow this anymore. And it's a nice illustration of the kind of attacks that we find at this layer in the protocol stack. Okay, and with this, we essentially have covered the most important aspects of network security.